Hello everyone, today we talk about the Ottonian army organization. We talked only a few last year ever about Ottonian warfare specifically. It's an incredibly important one, even though nothing from a strictly technical point of view is really changing, at least in an essential way. For example, from previous times, these are centuries in which the art of war is evolving quite gradually, all right, and especially from a material point of view, you do not get much of that. But yet, another reminder of the moral essence of military matters, right, and the fact that in the 10th century, in the second half, the Saxon house managed to not just win, as it had happened from a few decades before, the Eastern Frankish monarchy, but also the Imperial Roman one, changing effectively Western history forever. We made lots of videos about the Ottonians in general, right? Not so lots, I was actually checking the relative playlist today. I think that there are like a dozen videos, and it's too few. We need to talk more about them. Just the other day we were making a video about the late Carolingians, and in many ways Ottonian warfare can be introduced through that, right? You know that after, as we've seen, the death of Charlemagne's son Louis the Pious, the empire had passed to his grandchildren, that is Charlemagne's ones, each of whom essentially squabbled with the other. Also in this phase that in fact starts triggering the same so-called second invasions of the Vikings, the Magyars and the Saracens, until the empire practically disintegrated. This was actually happening for internal reasons that of course the external invaders helped, like, accelerating this collapse. It's useless to introduce like the entire political and social background. Now we will look at the situation in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, mostly through the military organization itself. So who were the people who served in the Ottonian armies, right? And what kind of landscape you can appreciate in 10th century Germany, culturally wise. That tells it all. I also made lots of videos comparing the main post-Carolingian realms with one another. These had in common the affirmation of the vassalic beneficiary system. The 10th century, as you know, is the moment in which probably a military class of professional militas, in fact, affirms itself as actually across like the post-Carolingian countries, with parallelisms also outside, even though this was actually the most military advanced of the Latin Germanic realities, and peculiar characteristics of the Eastern Frankish kingdom in particular will stand out, in fact, in the description of the Ottonian military, right, that we have already encountered in some videos dedicated specifically to campaigns, right, against the Slavs on the eastern frontier. We still didn't talk about Riade or Lechfeld. We, however, also watched a bit this relatively secondary scenarios, such as, for example, also the wars against the Western Franks, right? And we have observed how standardized warfare really was in many ways, and how there is properly a mathematical, quantitative, scale in strategy, logistics, military organization, and this in part overlaps with what we'll be seeing now, because unfortunately there isn't really too much about Ottonian warfare that we know in detail, and we most often rely, aside from the material side of the story and archaeology, but mostly on chroniclers, and that have specific ways of referring to using, for example, a particular vocabulary to military matters that are also within the spirit of the time. You know that the Ottonians fundamentally are the guys that transform an Imperium Francorum or Saxonum into properly a Roman Empire, right? In a strictly metaphysical and meta-ethnical terms, right? Because this is really the moment for many reasons, including, for example, the ties with the Byzantines, but mostly the revived affirmation of imperial power in Italy, right? The preference for Rome. Think about Otto III literally living in the Palatine, right? And all the reasons for which these Germanic rulers wanted to essentially transfer the center of their power in the Italian peninsula and ruling from there the entire Europe, but mainly the Mediterranean. That's something that, especially with what we start calling as Holy Roman Empire, is still the same. It's not just Charlemagne's empire, it's literally the Roman Empire that, again, I'm not going to discuss as far as this is concerned, because, you know, for many people it's a matter of personal opinion. It is also for me, to the degree, of course, it's debatable, but, you know, I made a pretty large, you know, quantity of videos that you can find in the Renovatio Imperii playlist explaining a bit the real deal, aside from the sort of legalistic, Byzantinistic principle of appointment, of cooptation of imperial power that the Germans lived in a complete, and not just the Germans. So here we're talking about probably Latin Germanic Europe really had been feeling from in a very different way from quite a long time, right? And again, I will be making a lot of stuff on the Ottonians, but also probably on the role of these specific peoples, right? It's incredible to think that the Saxons, so the most resistant people to the Carolingian conquest and forced Christianization, would become the champions of a purely Holy Roman imperial power, right? And I can't stress Roman enough, right? As we will see today, they literally call their armies legions, right, in their sources. And this is an aspect, admittedly, I haven't discussed too much in depth, so that's why I'm telling you like what I plan on doing, right? Surely we will make videos illustrating what was happening. I made a video, for example, on Italic warfare some time ago between the 9th and 11th century. That is not really the equivalent of this one, but we'll talk about also 10th century, say, Western Frankish warfare, Burgundian warfare, and more, right? So when we look at these three principal the divisions of the Carolingian Empire, we, of course, speak Western Francia, right, the Middle Kingdom or Lotharingia, but more specifically the Italy, because that's where the imperial title was really maintained in also this later centuries. Like if you didn't get the Italic crown, you couldn't be crowned Roman Emperor in Rome, right? So that's also the greatness of the Ottonians in retying Italy to the destinies of at least those who could revive this empire north of the Alps that had notably shifted towards the east. The reason also not being really so relevant from a strictly military point of view, because as we will see now, that there wasn't really anything too much distinctive about, say, Ottonian warfare just per se, right? More or less the Western Franks, the Italics, the Burgundians fought pretty much in the same way, right? The armies were similarly organized and they all came out of the same mold, right? But to make the long story short, given that it was paradoxically a less stratified system, and still what had become an aristocratically ruled, and this dynamic had definitely increased after the Carolingian conquest country, the power concentration was scarce. As you know, the Eastern Frankish kingdom would remain historically, as the Kingdom of Germany, an elective monarchy, and with that, like there was it was also a frontier area, especially the eastern part of the kingdom was historically without well outlined border, with this pretty insidious populations such as the Magyars and the Slavs that were at their following, right? Germany did suffer partially some Viking incursion from Fraxinetum. The Saracens managed even to enter the upper Rhine valley, but fundamentally it's from the east, right? And this world that is very much steppes influence, including the same Germany, like the Draconis standards, for example, would disappear in this country only in the 13th century, just to tell you that. And that's the actual dimension of Central Europe as opposed to Western Europe narrowly meant. Just certain parts of Germany can't fit that, like in mostly like the westernmost area, the Rhineland, and especially the richer south on the right bank of the Danube. But definitely these were tough times, and it was a general degree of militarization among these peoples that had, as say, being more primitively brought into this Teutonic reality that was literally made up by the monastic intelligentsia in the 9th century in places like Reichenau and St. Gallen to describe, in fact, Germanic peoples that, other than that, like there was a broader continuity of the Germanic world that was not included in the Eastern Frankish kingdom. The same peoples had their own pretty intense share of divide within this so pretty composite and divided area. Like, think about the massive forests that literally had molded, in fact, this historical stem duchies as the single provinces of the realm, and that mostly the Franks had sort of brought together under their rule, and that for this reason were, however, closer to that more archaic view of the relation between the divinity and, say, providence, military victory, and, say, a fresher race that at different times in history it sort of it literally poured out, also because of the lack of internal resources that very often didn't make it easy for the youth to live, right? Tough bands of mercenaries, of fighters, and so on, like the Saxons had been a thing, for example, within the same Frankish armies historically. And definitely this latter people of the world was the most bloody, the most really harsh, like still today, like in northern Germany, say, culturally symbolizes a bit like that crude and rude German spirit, like the, could have been echoing together with the war cries in the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, like crushing the Roman legions, and undergoing this incredibly traumatic and shocking, nightmarish, say, existence, like being hammered down by, again, Charlemagne and his paladins that definitely weren't people provided with a particularly pronounced sensitivity towards human mercy, and that themselves were co-opted in very harsh ways into, however, one of the single greatest successes, like I think in the history of civilization. I could digress on how the West habitually does this, like with enlightened elites that offer a chance of redemption to this sort of more disadvantaged commoners to syncretically and synergically like boom at some point. And admittedly, Saxony wouldn't, let's say, have much of a, say, leading role, like in German history, if not until, let's say, the 12th century, with the Welfen house opposed to the Hohenstaufen from Swabia. But in general, this was the peak, of course, of glory of this province and of its ducal dynasty that would in fact become the Eastern Frankish royal, but especially the Holy Roman Imperial one, right? And again, molding Europe in a really unique, as underrated way that I really hope to explore further. The Ottonian dynasty began to rule like from 919, at least as Eastern Frankish rulers, with Henry the Fowler, right? It was the first to inflict like a pretty heavy blow on the Magyars at the Battle of Riyadh, and much of the Ottonian fortune was due to the final, let's say, realization of the Eastern Frankish nobility that had actually been allowing these same raids that would even cross Germany. In fact, the point was that, especially in the eastern frontiers, to let the Magyars pass as they could go looting, I don't know, in Lotharingia, even in northeastern France, but eventually, like the most hit country was, of course, the same Eastern Frankish kingdom. At some point, they realized this, which had been carried out naturally to autonomize the stem dukes, right, from a monarchic control. Like, this had gone too far, right? Literally, Saxony, Thuringia, and Bavaria could realistically be destabilized, disarticulated as polities by these waves, and say the Eastern Frankish establishment conferred to the Ottonians, the Saxon house, like this role of leadership that was very well, say, fulfilled. And from there, of course, this power is spent to consolidate internally as much as possible, and eventually to cross the Alps and to reaffirm the control on Rome. The last emperor is Henry II. You have Otto I. You have Henry the Fowler that is not emperor. Then you have Otto I, the second, the third, and Henry II, the latter belonging to the Ottonian branch of Bavaria that had, say, already at that point sort of become even a bit of a competitor, unavoidably. The Bavarians are a bit the unsung heroes in the actual, like, continuous clash against the Magyars just across the land. The Saxons were a bit, like, more north, as you know. And again, there is a playlist if you want to look at the sort of political side of the story, the cultural one as well. You can check that, right? And the second half of the 10th century was therefore that crucial, right? You don't really see much change in European arms and armor, for example. There is something here and there, like mostly adapting slowly to a more, at least, say, collectively consolidated mounted warfare. It was happening at this point, but the Eastern Frankish kingdom is also pretty backwards in general. Like, it's not the place in which you find sort of the peak development, technically speaking, but it does have a lot of moral force, right? You do see developments in social and military organization to surpass this phase of stagnation, this crisis caused also by the external invasion. This is really the moment in which Europe shakes off itself the Vikings, the Saracens, the Magyars, the latter mostly handled by the Germans in this sense, and also sort of beaten for good in the sense that eventually Christian Hungary would be a product of this sort of stunning that the Hungars underwent after the Battle of the Lechfeld, like being fulgurated by these northern champions, sort of asserting at that point the righteousness and the superiority of the Christian Roman Empire. Christianity was advancing, not just in Hungary, but also Poland, Scandinavia, thanks to the Ottonians, as the ecclesiastical administration was all one with the expansion, say, with the evangelization of the surrounding peoples that were done so just by teaching, but also by the swords. Like, say, the Western Slavs do not understand very much, written words, especially from the dumb ones that are the Germans, because they don't speak their language. But Ottonian steel, like they do understand that, to a substantial amount. And it's not to say that they back down. Like nor Hungary nor Poland will be part, as you know, of the Holy Roman Empire. Bohemia would, and we've seen some Ottonian campaigns there, and that's a hell of a history. Also, Bohemia would become in many ways sort of the most, in fact, westernized and in part Germanized of these three main realms, to the point of actually becoming one of the electors of the same Germany as a whole. These Saxon emperors of Germany are surely the guys who make this greater effort of also economical expansion, financing new infrastructure, like aggrandizing their own role, like idealizing it in that Roman fashion, and reviving essentially the power of the old pre-Carolingian tribal duchies that to some extent had maybe even thought to sort of, if not reverting back to the previous order, but truly like trying mostly to think by themselves. As we've seen, they had been responsible for the same crisis as every people to whom something happens at the end of the day really is. And this new force, this rejuvenation, if you want, still falls pretty kindly with sort of the historical reconstruction and with the reflection in the regional organization of large armies for the times, and particularly around Saxony. As in the Western Frankish kingdom, the nucleus of the Ottonian army consisted of these feudal vassals of the king and the nobility. It's pretty standard, right? This is the typically vassalitic beneficiary system. I give you something in advance in terms of prepaid resources for providing with military service. You get installed into this castle ruling over the surrounding lands. You have just the challenge of keeping that together in the continuous competition, and we sort of establish this relation for which, if I need some extras for my sort of regional rather than provincial campaigns, you will provide with an elite of military professionals that can in fact maintain, but quality, a level of specialization, a standard capable of also fitting a broader army, a larger military of, in fact, imperial might. This is not, again, an innovative system per se, but that in the relentless effort of properly molding from the blood and the earth of these places, a solid hierarchical order is really relevant, to say the least, right? So the mechanism we just described, benefices of land, sometimes money, because something monetary is really restarting at this point, also in a country like Eastern Francia, to a relevant degree, but also like in nature sometimes, food, directly like equipment, that the senores and their militas were connected by this role of mutual assistance, for which some of these retinues were literally leaving to the lord's household and provided with the arms and armor, often also stripped from the enemy and redistributed by the leader to his faithful followers. Right? Let's stress the fact that this country is, in that sort of traditional mindset, more primitive, like the word of the war band, right, of the roaming, as we will see now, mercenaries. Also, could be a bit like in the Viking world, that was, however, much more unstable, less cohesive, is still there, right? The migration era is not that far away, and it's also not just in a temporal, in a chronological sense, but in a geographical one, because further east, again, you have pretty interesting things going on. In terms of interest, the Ottonians had multiple times to put down Eastern Frankish rebellions, sometimes led even by members of the same Ottonian dynasty. And this, well, what was really at stake in terms of retribution, right? Also, like the capacity of racketing this wealth from the surrounding peoples, like, for example, through the tribute money paid by conquered or client Slavic tribes, it would be the most typical thing, was really enticing. The church has a great importance. Ecclesiastical lands maintained feudal troops by the same exact means. That the German episcopate, to a degree, will remain possibly the most militarized of the entire post-Carolingian Europe. These war bands, vassals, that is fair to call them like this, in the contemporary sources are referred to as Militas Armati, Manus Militum, Militas Satellites, all terms that are quite eloquent of the essence of these fighters. Militas Armati means literally like armored, warriors. Like the concept of cavalryman is ingrained, this was present, like the hero, even in the, say, still in the pagan world. If you look at the Norse, even in the previous centuries, is always, even if mostly those armies had been fighting on foot in the central northern Europe, were conceived as horsemen, right? And it's at this point that the concept of milas, of course, starts identifying ever more like the heavily armored professional horsemen, right, that fights in collective formation, performing this extraordinary shock charges, right? But Germany is a country which cavalry will take a bit more time to fully develop. It's not before the second half of the 12th century that the Hohenstaufen managed to import, like, properly what had been the Western French, if you want, form of feudalism, especially in the more developed part of Germany. Right, the northeast remains a bit more obscure in this sense, a bit more blurred, also with the warfare of the neighboring peoples. Consider that Saxony is there, right? The main centers of Ottonian power, also for strategical, logistical reasons, were all on the eastern frontier. Think about Magdeburg, Merseburg. We will see them now in part. We have already seen them on the map in those videos about the campaigns against the neighboring tribes of the Slavic East, right? The more troublesome. So it's important here to stress mostly the armatus referred to the milas. So the fact that now, like, there is a level of quasi-standardization regarding the heaviness of their armament. Manus militum simply means like a maniple, like a handful, like intended as a war band, as a retinue of some sort of militum, genitive. Then simply militas, of course, and or satellites, which in the latter case stands, as you understand, for someone revolving around someone else. Mostly we'll see now by which means. There is still, interestingly enough, the old term comitatus that we have actually described most of in migration era warfare, so the Comes and his war band, and it's a term that of course overlaps in part with sort of the more let's say standard like level of civil administration that the empire had ingrained. Like since Carolingian times, there are counties and in fact laid temporal rulers that are in the form of the count himself, and then the bishop that supports morally. But here the term is referred to properly the war band, the ancient comitatus, the one described by Tacitus, ideally, that just of course has evolved over time, but that conceptually is actually not that far from the ancestor of the original. These troops were, like, as the heavy part, all the noblemen of lesser or greater standing, which in Germany is very important because, as we will see later, and as we have actually seen in many videos dedicated to the Ministeriales, the personal freedom of warriors in Germany at this point had been sinking, right? And actually, in the following centuries, you have the development this servile military class, lasting until the 13th century, that even surpasses numerically, and especially from the estates of the more powerful Eastern Frankish princes, the same free, like the noblemen, right? And on the concept of nobility, remember always that in origin, like for the Romans, for the Germans, being free equated to at least a degree of nobility, right? And so being free in this world, being recognized, especially in a country that eventually hadn't had historically like a public culture that was very privatized and would maintain sort of this outlook with a greater political instability, some greater entrenchment of strictly feudal prerogatives in a country where more or less, in fact, any other person was kind of somebody else's person, is incredibly relevant. We have pointed that out for Germany, even for the Renaissance, what it meant for the Landsknechten to have been elevated as an estate of the empire, separated from their peasantry origin, from which they were eager to, of course, to detach themselves, and the pride of bearing arms as imperial soldiers, right? So here, like, it's difficult, the divide between free and not free is very blurred sometimes, because of the aforementioned instability, difficulty of public control. Some of you asked me, like in a video I made recently about the Ministeriales, like, why is this in Germany and not in other places? Because in other places there was a much more, say, outlined regulation, like at a political, juridical, social level, who was free, who wasn't, like what kind of estates were what, and what, generally speaking, like they could have their rights represented. Germany has a more fragile state, is more privatistic in mindset, and so there is first less power down the line, like in terms of actual direct control of royal authority, and so capacity of intervention and justice, and so there are more coercions, there are more abuses that really are settled in a sort of private mob-like fashion, and also there is a greater need, we will see now, of co-opting more or less whoever you had available for these tasks of defense as well. Of course, the Ministeriales would be born also because they, as serfs, they wouldn't inherit. Like, so as literal vassals, they had all the duties, but none of the rights, except the fact they were protected by their lords, that were extremely jealous of them, because of course any insult to them, and if they were serfs, equated to an insult to them. And so in this sort of feud ruled and sort of, again, mobster-like, mobster-minded reality, there is a much greater need of having this bands of armed tax, even from like whoever you had, like in a poorly stratified reality compared to at least the other post-Carolingian kingdoms, but that could, in this sense, take matters more directly in his own hands, right? And this is the interesting side of the story. So again, these militas at large at this point still were free, and of course they had a degree of dependency on their lords. Mostly they came as, again, the heavily clad mounted warriors from the estates of their lord. Like they were vassals in practice. However, they also and frequently included the impoverished noblemen from other regions. It could be, like, the more peripheral one of the same Eastern Frankish kingdom, and or even more far away, as we will see now, with depending, like we will have even Danish or Slavic, like literally pagan mercenaries at some point that eventually would we imagine also remain in Germany. It's not a massive phenomenon, but it does exist, right? This was the elite, the armored cavalrymen, the miles armatus. The rest of the fighters were simply called things like shield bearers, Clipeati Militas or Scutiferi. That refers to that sort of subservient sort of knecht, in fact. So the etymology of knight, even though that evolved towards actually the most noble of them all. But the idea of servitude is actually inherent, the concept of knecht, right? And we will see it also actually in some aspect of the very underrated chivalric military culture of the Anglo-Saxons. That I have a video in store about. So in many ways, in spite of the public sort of formalities that, of course, the Eastern Frankish kings would keep trying at least to maintain and to consolidate, the army and the actual military force of Germany at this point was these retinues, right? Not differently from, again, the rest of the world, but with this greater level of privatization and sort of also individualistic mindset than compared to the other post-Carolingian realms. The Saxon exercitus army was fundamental, of course, to the power of Henry I and the Ottos who succeeded him. Saxony had, of course, a centrality in this process because, again, they had tougher people, they had sort of a more brutal mindset and capacity to enforce themselves. Of course, this all came from also a very shrewd policy that sort of, let's say, connects all the great German ruling dynasties during the Middle Ages. All these guys, the most successful ones, like, I don't know, Otto I, Frederick Barbarossa, even the Habsburgs later on, were all had been all blessed by a relentless power-building construction by Conrad II, Frederick Barbarossa, had all been blessed by the relentless power building that their fathers had carried out by literally erecting fortresses in large numbers, like maintaining their political, diplomatical, and military relations with the aristocracy, and starting from their personal private power. This is really typical of Germany. Only those who can bring on the table, like privately, a lot of wealth, a lot of money, can succeed. And you know that this is true in terms of power building for every monarchy, but the fact that the Eastern Frankish one was elective and that the areas of power shifted across Germany during the centuries, of course, has to do with the competition of these groups in a country where, again, the central authority was quite feeble. The new Saxon rulers encouraged the breeding of many more horses. For example, it may seem banal, but it did cost. It required investment, time, right, foresightness, in order to enlarge the cavalry element in their forces. That was becoming the most important one, like fighting, very much like the Carolingians, actually, campaign after campaign every year, right, and with sometimes even pretty tight resources in relative terms, but in this sense, ever more driven, ever more guided by the acknowledgement that, of course, that the more they were able to keep that up, the more they could replenish the same moral and material means, and that's how they would win the empire, right? Of course, within the same Eastern Frankish kingdom, military power under the Ottonians was far more fragmented than under the Carolingians, right? By the end of the 10th century, armies were dominated, as we've seen, still by contingents of militas or vassals under counts and margraves, whose loyalty was often dubious, right? The military organization in Ottonian Germany was typically decimal, right? And the largest unit was the apparently 1,000 men strong legion. So literally the legion, which was also called for this reason of the 1,000 Aemilia, right? Legion, as you know, comes from literally the same etymology of collection, right? That's how the troops were recruited in ancient Rome. Here, at least in the chronicles of the Ottonian era, we get the association also because, of course, the consonants with Rome, the Renovatio Imperii, and so on. We have seen it in reading the sources in the videos about the Ottonian campaigns. Widukind specifically states that the Bohemian Legion at Lechfeld, these were, as we will see now, subjects to the Ottonians fighting finally back against the Magyars themselves, was 1,000 men. So the strength of the legion was probably officially around that, even though numbers would practically vary much, right? From the campaigns, as I said before, you have the impression that more or less the organization was sort of standardized. At least the strength ratios, especially in siege warfare, was quite frequent, were often like always the same. They literally calculated they required like an advantage of 4 or 5 to 1 in order to storm the fortifications. But of course, we're talking about forces gathered in sort of heterogeneous ways. Also along the way, because yes, there were some sort of gathering points, but for practical reasons, like it was easier just to concentrate on one point, arriving each army, say from each stem duchy, participating to the expedition, rather than like creating that like fully ordered army at the beginning. Things would come just by themselves. It's more accurate to compare the Ottonian Legion to what would become the later sort of battle line, right? The idea of battle as one line of hundreds, ideally even thousands, but this sense, as you know, not much more than 1,000. Also because the complementary elements had to be technically functional to the unit organization, mostly with in fact, heavy cavalry function, so a shock capacity, that however could also be on foot as well. This is typical of Germany until the 11th, the 12th century. You do find large royal armies, we will see it in some battle video, dismounting on a regular basis, say deploying behind a stream, or in that sense meeting cavalry on foot, right, with certain specific vibes. Think about the Battle of Civitatis, slightly later to this time, just a generation from the last Ottonians, but the famous Swabians fighting on foot against the Norman cavalry charges. That was the difference between, in that case, the Western Frankish world and the Eastern Frankish one, between the Western and the Eastern Frankish worlds, still highlighting the wild, sort of primitive nature of Germany. Imagine even what this land really was like, and it's not until to the fullest, the mid 12th century, that Germany starts being adequately sort of cleared, deforested, reclaimed, and the terrain too was often better suited for foot, not even dismounted combat than else. Right. Still, the Eastern Frankish kingdom does develop that cavalry, superiority. Say the Vikings do not have the same mounted capacity of the Germans, but the latter are just like a bit above that, right? They're not exactly too far from it. Naturally, there are differences across Germany, and now we can't simply digress on because the video is already too long. We will get into also slightly later German history to show how this trend continued was sort of a big thing to again remold the entire land for updating it to the sort of highest levels of the current Western military art. The legion, thus, just like the battle line that it technically was, could be, and this was normally medieval warfare, composed or decomposed according to the contingent strategical, tactical, operational needs, right? Especially when you have coalition forces, like, say, most medieval armies really are, you sort of build up these battle lines, of course following some principle of cohesion based on the, say, ethnic origin of the contingents, say from which stem duchy would they come from, under the guidance of a single prince in that case. But they could sometimes, they would be put together. Also, like, the guys from the same stem duchies were not necessarily like knowing each other or being so that say close-knit to provide, because this was the ultimate point, like that level of collective training that only at this point was fully emerging, like in a consistent way, out of the molding of Carolingian cavalry that we described. It was an incredibly, again, slow, say gradual process, but it was also a very, very powerful one. Like, the Westerners were becoming the most punching in terms of shock charge, and they would maintain the upper hand forever at that point. There were also auxiliary cavalry forces, foreigners if you want, from peoples, as we've seen, like the Slavs, that were normally lighter than the Germans, and that were sort of becoming heavier in the elite component, exactly like with a strong Eastern Frankish influence in arms and armor, but also military vocabulary. We've seen it in the videos about, for example, Polish warfare, and that's a trend that continues. We see German arms and armor becoming sort of the gold standard for all Central and even Eastern Europe. We've seen how the Kievan Rus, for example, imported a lot of Western hardware, military hardware, and was essentially molding before the Mongol invasions more on that sort of Western basis than anything. Like Central, also Eastern Europe was sort of much closer to Central Europe historically at this point than it would be later after the Mongol conquest. We do see also more or less well-armed retainers, right? So also people of lesser status that could be included in the legion. Also for, as we've seen, those reasons of practical purpose. If these were squires of some sort, like they would help their heavily armored horsemen. They were becoming ever more, yes, punching, but also more relying on the help, the support of their retainers. They were becoming sort of panzer, literally needing like somebody telling, like, watch right, watch left, like a modern tank, really. The standard subunits seemingly were around 100 men when we talk about this sort of foreign, sort of lesser troops. For example, Poland and Bohemia normally sent 300 men each, which suggests that probably the subdivision was something along that tripartition. Politically fragmented world, the importance of, for example, a territorially rooted force, right, or some sort of permanent war band used specifically for defense, and even more specifically in the marches and frontier regions, really played a dominant role sometimes locally. Right? We have, for example, the Legio Mesaburiorum, established by Henry the Fowler. This is essentially considered as a legion proper, in Merseburg on the Saale, right? We are in the east, it's today's Saxon Anhalt, and so areas that needed really to be garrisoned and maintained with a significant strategic force, the particularity of which was the non-feudal and non-noble nature. Essentially, Henry the Fowler decided to stabilize some war bands of literal outlaws and bandits who had been graced in exchange expressly for military service. Right? This is like speaking volumes about the nature of these forces and of the frontier as well. They surely were made up by a large number of adventurers. At this point, we shouldn't be surprised to see a Viking, a Magyar, or God knows whom there, right? They surely didn't have like much better etiquette than the raiders that they had been come to fight, to counter on this frontier for defensive purposes. It was a job, right? The Duke of Saxony would pay them for this, and they were honored by it, right? Even if they were some sort of scumbags, but in many ways, like for the times, for the places, they would do, right? This is a very interesting example. In addition to these essentially either professional, semi-professional forces that we can assimilate also to permanent, semi-permanent ones, I discussed this at length. We mostly think that it's only towards the later Middle Ages that there were permanent armies, because modernists have imposed us this de facto, like those who could afford that knightly panoply and lifestyle would be permanent forces because they were always up to warfare, and as we'll see now, military training, but it was probably their lifestyle. They didn't know anything but war, right? But were also, of course, next to the elite, the general levies of the Germanic forces, like free or half-free peasants, organized as well on a decimal basis, following hierarchically the cavalry forces. In this country, not much had really changed from the previous centuries. Essentially, at least among the old Saxons, all men over the age of 13 appear to have served during the 10th century. It was actually unusual, especially to have like the entire levies, right? But when you actually look at the Ottonian campaigns, there is the understanding that even though, again, the vassalitic beneficiary system was mostly working also as a sort of social engineering to, again, foster this most just elite of truly professional forces, and the rest was ever more sort of subjected to the effort, mostly in a civilian sense, the contribution of the local levies was significant, and that, yes, the level of militarization was intense. People aged faster, like at 13, if you survived in that world at that time, you were already a man, right? You can easily see it with, pictures or stories of your grandparents or great-grandparents. You look at their photos, 13, 14, they look like 25, 30, all right, in terms of maturity and outlook. And those words were really making you age that fast for these services. Of course, there were different things that the youngsters could do, also because they were usually like also to grow in the hierarchy. Even when there were noblemen, that there was that tradition of, again, fostering these kids at somebody else's household as squires, and then evolving, and also in the radically brutal and traumatic ways that they were actually brought under and disciplined and sort of made men up, right? Okay, the Ottonian knight is yet another figure, as we were saying before, that is not particularly, provided with much remorse for slaughtering large amounts of human beings. That's what they do for a living. That's what they are conceived for. Like, self-sacrifice in holy combat is the greatest honor that any man can ever obtain. The same empire is conquered like this, right? The Saxons are really that brutal and crude. But in many ways, it was the world of the time that really was like this. But going back to the levies, their duties were, again, pretty much the same recorded for the earlier, not just Carolingian, but literally also Merovingian period, right? For at least those areas of Germany that had already been under the Franks, right? Germany had historically always been under the aristocracies. We don't have to think that, it was, because of the Carolingians that, the freemen had ever been living into a sort of anarchic utopia in which they were, pure and out there and breathing, the air, the sky of freedom before someone came crashing a crucifix into their heads. Like the Germanic aristocracies since the migration era had been some of the most shockingly violent and radically traumatic, subjecting, socially molding forces that had ever been out there. It was true actually also for the previous times, but at least the freemen had maintained as a body corporate, let's say, some sort of greater capacity of countering also the same cavalry, for example. So there is no doubt that especially the Carolingian times mark a very radical and violent watershed in the history of these places, and the 9th century, the 10th, are a relentless continuation of that sort of political and social engineering. But again, there were also difficulties to actually control the entire system. So the noblemen at a local level would be having a dialogue with the local population. They would know essentially what they could rely on, like serfs or not serfs. And that's also how, as we'll see now, the Ministeriales were born, right? The, say, gradual outdating of the levy can be observed in the less frequent call of the same. Sometimes we see the levies being called in a non-military capacity, literally as servants or laborers, and that's the degree by which they had been subjected historically to their lords. We do see sometimes cash payments in lieu of service, right, which would do, because as we've seen, as we will keep seeing now, there were mercenaries, right? There were ways just to say, okay, I pay you something, like also in nature. We've seen it recently in the videos about the seigneurial system, the corvée, and so on. I don't want to go to war, just take care of it. I renounce a part of my liberty, I will be working for you, but, just feel that goddamn Milas that is the top-notch force you can have out there. It's really a compromise, right, between the two. It's in part giving away your freedom, but also not having much of a choice, right? Also in a rational sense, because having fewer good professional soldiers was better than having packs of sort of more or less violent, but still, pretty scarce, performingly speaking, like peasantry out there. There are some parts of Germany that really will feel like pretty angry and effective peasantry for a long time. We're talking paradoxically just in relation of the local standards, right? Think about the Dittmarsch or the Swiss, like in the beginning of the 14th century, like thought that they managed to beat cavalry because they were, carrying like a military tradition of a sophistication or advancement. They just, like, the local nobility was weak. There was a general crisis. They took the chance in doing that. But you do find in German history this sort of, it's never like Flanders or northern Italy, but it's still something like, there is some infantry somewhere that does pop up as doing something on the battlefield, subordinated to cavalry. Germany, oddly enough, except for Switzerland, doesn't have that even those victories of infantrymen at the beginning of the 14th century. So that's actually a pretty powerful indicator of how things had been going also in the previous centuries. Money was used also to hire mercenary, simply, like maintaining somebody's armament. Like, there were many ways you could spend them, of course, right, including building fortresses. The 10th century is the great century of Castellation, as we well know. So that one of the duties of the levy properly revolved around building and maintaining fortresses, especially in the marches areas. This is obvious. Think about, during the same century, the boroughs of the Anglo-Saxons. These were inhabited by people who normally would have had been called for the levy in the military expedition, but the English kings start preferring we'll remain in this place, but in lieu of military service in the expedition across the country, you have to garrison this place, you have to work to build the fortifications, to have them stronger. And this also does correspond to a process of encastellation. The imperial control of the eastern frontier provinces against the Magyars and the Slavs was stricter than elsewhere. There was a network of fortified burgwarts created. Interestingly enough, these places were garrisoned not just by the ethnic Germans, also by the conquered Slavs that had remained there, among whom the German settlers had been newly established, also as rulers, because of course they had a higher status, even though, again, the Germano-Slavic frontier at this point is like that blurred, you can't even tell, right? There would be lots of Slavic aristocrats that sort of were co-opted in Ottonian times, and some Germans were also of Slavic origin since the migration era. It was a significant penetration in Thuringia, in southeastern Germany, and so on, for quite an ancient time. Henry the Fowler introduced a system where every 9th man would live in one of these fortified emplacements of some sort. Some were properly towns, other times were literally just towers. Like if you see also in later times where the Ministeriales lived, and archaeologically we have more evidence, of course, from the later centuries. Sometimes there are still standing in Germany into the middle of apparently nowhere. Like, just imagine this beautiful, like, forested landscapes, and then just a tower in the midst of that. And by a tower, I mean literally a cell, right? Not a major, like a dungeon or something. Like, literally like a little emplacement where these guys had to watch, like sort of watchtowers rather than else. Of course, these places were differently populated at the time sometimes, and of course here we're talking about the establishment also of significant fortifications that would give birth, especially in the less developed areas in the longer run, to the rise of actual towns, also important ones, in Germany still today, right? The purpose was, however, like among in particular areas, having one guy, again out of 9, that would be living into some sort of entrenched position, and the other man would have to help him build and maintain it by storing 1/3 of their agricultural surplus that they would keep producing within the same fortified place, right? And this was a measure enacted by Henry the Fowler especially to preserve the harvest in the hardest times of Magyar and Slavic raids. The idea was, let's fortify further, even in this pretty desolated landscape that has hardly known up to this point, even probably real urbanization, like some sort of stronger infrastructural basis. Again, everything is very slow and gradual. Like it takes time before it impacts the local level. The population is not very dense. Like resources are limited, but these are organized in a way that is more functional to cope with these external threats, and that also like is directed and looks up to like a greater authority that can say, well, I established this duty, I had the power of enforcing it fundamentally, and so this has to do, of course, with a public prerogative, because the establishment of fortifications in post-Carolingian Europe does remain, of course, a royal business. Fundamentally, nobody could usurp that. Like in Germany, this would happen, on a devastating basis. But historically, but at the same time, it also began as the initiation of a state. So in a way, the men living in the fortified emplacement were some sort of lower vassals. Sometimes they are defined as Agrarian Militas, a term evidently used to refer to the, say, rural dimension where these were established, because again, if there had already been a significantly fortified emplacement around, they would have sort of already been part of somebody else's rule, of some, elite, some nobility that ran the local community. So this was also a way to coagulate further settlements, to render life a bit more difficult to the invaders, and to create concentration of resources, some strategic and logistical support that in these parts of the Eastern Frankish world had been more of a challenge compared to the West, right? And these Agrarian Militas, even though they are called Militas, were mostly infantry, actually. And so their, say, status of Milas consisted mostly in the fact that they had this duty, and that they were in part rewarded by the management of these fortifications. However, the most concrete practice was grafting some milas armatus at the head of this place, right? So you could, this could be a way to create one on the longer run, right? In fact, these Agrarian Militas were in many ways the forerunners of the Ministeriales, the unfreed knights, and that's how they had born, from more humble origins, from, in fact, like peasantry one that in these places is mostly like, a non-free one, and that is connected, however, with a higher power, and that will make, in fact, these men, even when of lower origins, sometimes, if not often, more powerful than many free militas. There is interesting evidence of the numbers of troops available in an Ottonian army. For example, we know of 32 legions mustered for an attack on the Capetian Hugh in 946. These would include some proper Western Frankish and as well as more Eastern Frankish Flemish units. So we've seen some of these campaigns already. At the Battle of Lechfeld, the great victory of Otto the First in 955 over the Magyars, there were 8 legions, However, in this case, probably a more usual size for an army. Remember that the legions could vary in size, so if you say 32 legions, it doesn't mean 32,000 men on horseback, right? It could be maybe just like the grand total of all the forces with much weaker elements within as infantry, field aids, etc. Right, at Lechfeld you can imagine the finest Eastern Frankish cavalry from all across the kingdom being gathered, and with a very high level of cohesion, by the way, that manages in fact to crash the Magyar host as well. The most detailed account is probably the one about the Italian campaign of Otto II, whose army is described in a unique surviving manuscript, the Indiculus Loricatorum. So the Loricatus was the heavily armored, right, from Lorica, the cuirass. And so the idea was that these texts that, again, survived to us just in this example, but that were, of course, drafted at the time regularly when armies were summoned, was all an administration. Especially the reason why it's preserved, it's evidently that in Italy there was greater sort of literacy and, public administration going on and so on. That tells us, breaks down to us literally this force of the Loricati proper, that are 2,080 feudal cavalry from Lotharingia, Bavaria, Franconia, and Swabia, awed by certain major lay and ecclesiastical princes. So as we see in western and southern Germany, 1,482 of them were specifically from ecclesiastical landowners, right? And this account is interesting because while dating to 981, is referring also to part of this force which would be selected in the expedition in the following year at Cotrone, Cape Colonna in Calabria, where notoriously the Imperial army was destroyed with a massive bloodshed. It was one of the single most terrifying defeats in medieval history. We're talking a figure of 4,000 men killed plus many more captured. This is when the same Otto II barely escaped with his life being picked up along the coast by a Byzantine fleet that was passing by, and as you know, he had a Byzantine bride, but these guys thought well to, because there was always a competition between the Byzantines and the Ottonians in southern Italy, to actually capture the same emperor who, actually understanding this, threw himself overboard and reached swimming the Calabrian coast in a sort of better place, where he in fact came back home, even though he would leave only for a short time afterwards. He died in Italy because of illness, right? But the interesting aspect here is again, bishops, noblemen died. As we've seen from the numbers, 3/4 of this force came actually from church estates, right? The rest from secular lords. And this is a trend actually that will continue in the following centuries. If you look at Frederick Barbarossa's armies, most of the Ministeriales that made up his force, as the majority of it, were from ecclesiastical princes, right? This was historically a necessity, because the ecclesiastical princes, albeit quite warlike in Germany, were still weaker than the more brutal lay ones, and so they had consistently been back, and they would keep backing the monarchy and the state and public authority, not differently from actually all the rest of the church in the other countries, right? the largest church contingent in the aforementioned document totaled 100 men. 40 was the largest from a lay lord. So, again, the ecclesiastical military retinues were amazing. It's been estimated that by the 13th century, the Abbey of Fulda had something like 20,000 men in her service. We do not know better, unfortunately, but this gives you a dimension of how powerful the church really was. The smallest unit totaled 10 men, gloricati. In addition, the imperial household troops that were the elite and the elite, think about the bodyguard, right? That, interestingly enough, was also recruited from specially trained slaves, right? And such was the serf cavalry, the Dienstleute, so those who had to provide the service. In Latin, that they are the Ministeriales that would become so characteristic of medieval Germany, right? It's really a long-term development of this force. We know that at the beginning of the 11th century, the last Ottonian, Henry II, had adequate troops to promise a Milanese rebel that was fighting on his behalf against the Italic ruler, was challenging the German domination. The loan of 4,000 knights, and we think that these were Ministeriales. Naturally, the more time goes on, and the stronger, the sort of more feudalized this force has really become also on the field. It's, however, really in salient times, and since the beginning of Conrad II, and I made a video about Germany in his times, 1024, 1039, that the Ministeriales were actually introduced on a large scale, to the scale that we sort of became more familiar with. You know, that have a playlist dedicated specifically to the Ministeriales, not just from a military point of view, but significantly in the political and social role that they perform, right? So, in a status sense, a Ministerialis is perhaps best described as an unfree man, in possession, however, of a beneficium, with the consequent duty deriving from it of performing a military service that is identical to the one that a free feudal tenant would. Right? The counterpart, again, is that he was a serf, and thus he could not inherit. He didn't have the same, liberty of a free knight. He is, however, in virtue of his servile status, way more dependent on his lord. So he has all the interest of remaining in this condition, because even though he can't be bought, sold, like relocated with his family and so on, wherever his lord wants in Germany or even abroad, he wouldn't have any of that absolute power as a serf out of this relationship, right? And so actually some of these guys will become more powerful than the same nobility over time. And in the 13th century, they are so, in fact, equal to it that also the juridical distinction falls apart. And so in the 14th, you don't even technically see Ministeriales anymore. There is actually a crisis of the entire German knighthood at that point. So you find all these, because of the rise of the princes, I made multiple videos in princely Germany. And also the general crisis of the era, of the same empire, as a matter of fact, that brings these guys to form mercenary companies, to be hired abroad, and so on, right? As we've seen, the connection between the Ministeriales and the church lands had been very strong from quite a long time. The prelates were obliged to supply feudal troops identically to the nobility. So, not to disperse in this very, again, privatized country in which the land tended to be lost, right, to the aristocracy you would infer in your own land, and given the general instability and the presence of this masses of almost military colonists, like within the same country, you would use the ones of servile origin, right, free men, to provide and to have this lands run by, and literally elevating them, giving them a reason to fight for them. And this is true also for royalty, right? Royalty and the church would make an astonishingly large use of Ministeriales that would become, again, widespread in Germany. Today we do not talk about tactics, because it's our usual video about the army organization, but you have to understand, of course, that all these militas, regardless of their social status, were really fighting in the standard Western European way. Again, there is no difference whatsoever, and I can't stress this enough, between a Ministerialis and another knight. Zero. Right? At best, it's the Germans that, as a whole, have, as we've seen, like a greater tendency to fight on foot, that take a longer time to actually establish really a feudal military estate, and so the same military standards of Western Europe. But we're still talking about close packed formations of, likely, speaking of organization, 50 men each, maybe 25. That's normally how they were broken down, subunits, in making up those aforementioned legions, battle lines. Cavalry dominated later 10th century German warfare already, right? Especially against the eastern neighbors, the Slavs, the Magyars. These were like a might to be reckoned. Their training was historically in line with what, like, heavy cavalry had always sort of been molded like. There were proper games. Think about the Astiludia of Carolingian times, and back in the day there had been, like, in Roman times, the Upica Gymnasia. So we're talking about the ancestors of what we will know as the medieval tournament. This training could be, again, viciously violent during the 11th to 12th century, and naturally all the way before. There was literally zero difference between real battles and these sort of tournaments. It was normal to kill people, to break their bones, and people were excited to do so. Like, they lived only for this. It was just to elevate that sense of risk, of gamble, of excitement that the military feeds off from the tradition of self-sacrifice in holy combat. This dates all the way back to Tacitus describing to us the Germanic elite exciting themselves, betting on, the naked youth running into, like, a forest of spears to see, who would make it out alive. These were the tender and cute means in which, like, the German youth, that was actually quite prized at the time. There was a sense that these people were tough. They were, like, even if they were less sort of developed in this sense, they made excellent chargers. They had this impetus, the famous Furor Teutonicus, like all this. That is a real thing. Like, I actually studied this stuff also for later times, the 13th to 14th century. The Germans had this. They came from, again, a much more turbulent sort of frontier world. They were more out there with a feudal mentality, still soaked with the songs of the Nibelungs, of the excitement of the Valhalla of this glory that they could make them win a place in the firmament before being reawakened for the the fight in the end time against the utter evil. Like think about the Asgard, and why these guys were maybe defending this stinky, moat and bailey sort of dirt and timber fortifications against some savage Magyar that wanted to take a scalp out of them, literally, like being inflamed with pure, total, complete excitement in literally being in that situation of, risking and getting closer to divine transfiguration and testing their quality. And all the community was about this. They were living with that ingrained in their brains, and it's extremely difficult for us, of course, to come close to that. But say most of our traditional beliefs, the ones still surviving from chivalric times, actually are coming straight out of that, of a millenary tradition that dates back to the Indo-Europeans and their equestrian culture, etc. Right? But going back to training, like this was literally like a sport. Like they had fun. Every unit had its own banner. Flags were also being sort of refined, because with cavalry tactics development, you needed to know more directly who was who on the field, because things were getting much more dynamic than the usual, say, historically. Like, by the time of Charlemagne's conquest, like the Saxons were still mostly about infantry, a sort of phalanx, a bit like the Norse ones, right, that we have observed in Viking warfare, right? By now, things were getting more complex, right? Otto the First's elite unit of cavalry had, for example, a flag portraying the Archangel Michael that was pretty pan-European, symbol of collective exaltation. Like you have this angelic / etheric, because the symbol is always dual symbolism from the Gepids, apparently influencing the same iconography of coin minting in Justinian's empire, which is something that pops up also because of the Germanic auxiliaries that were present in the Roman army at that time. As you know, the Normans are literally fixated with the Archangel Michael. Think about Mont Saint-Michel. The Longobards are literally fixated with the Archangel Michael. Think about the monastery of Saint Michael in the Gargano Peninsula, and how when the Normans a bit later in these years conquer southern Italy, they're all one with that ideology and symbolism, right, with their Longobard subjects. And here Otto the First has a banner of the Archangel Michael, flag banner, while the Imperial banner proper, like the Emperor's one, was later recorded as consisting, interestingly enough, of a silken dragon on a pole surmounted by an eagle, right? And the idea, of course, was the victory over evil. It was basically the same symbolism. The defeat of the cosmic snake, right? And the Apollonian eagle destroying the rotor of the roots of the same Yggdrasil, which, in that sense, it's as if like when the Franks were cutting down the Saxon sacred oak, like this had seen in the same Charlemagne the dragon destroying their world, but now evangelized, they realized the higher good, they got higher power, especially while they were literally now Roman emperors, and they had the divine right to boast the eagle as world rulers, right? And having seen, especially having married with the Byzantines, well, not yet, because it's rather Otto's son that will, but of course his father was already, of course, he was the one who prepared that, and so was taking on the universal imperial Catholic symbolism of this all. And this, interestingly enough, this banner is recorded being mounted in a 4-horse cart, which is also very similar to what we will know of the Italian communal carroccio will be, We will make a video of that unit at some point, which is also, I don't know, think about the Teutonic orders bringing their literal organ to play Marian hymns before chopping to pieces large extents of Baltic people in general, like not even pagans, because, you know, they're Baltic, so, you know, who cares if they have even converted to Christianity. The Teutonic Knights must have fun in a way or another. They have to keep in shape. And these are the levels of brutality that we're talking about from these very mindsets. Like, we sort of think, well, maybe these are prejudices, they are, you know, exaggerated. No, if you actually studied the sources, if you understand how they lived and how they behaved, it is all actually magnified in a way that you do not see in any pop culture representation of this all. And this comes with a, you know, a pack of moral force that is also the only one that can explain why a Saxon house could take over now the empire, right, and embody it to the extreme. Charlemagne, Otto I, and Frederick Barbarossa are the three great pillars of Imperial German mysticism for a reason, right? And we will talk, again, more about the Ottonians because they are really something in the history of Europe. Let's mention now, however, the importance of auxiliaries that were out there, like next to these increasingly important armored cavalrymen. You do find all the peoples that the Imperials already had managed to subjugate and or attract, you know, one or another under their banners, right? So you have actually all the enemies of the same Ottonians serving as auxiliaries at some point. The Magyars, right? There would be some, you know, Hungarian horse band that would be hired, right? They didn't care after about broader, you know, principles. Of course, they were some sort of countercultural force of chaos that had to erode this imperial Catholic empire, but they would fail and eventually would be absorbed and subsumed literally by the same. Poles, the Wends, we'll have to talk about then at some point. Other Slavs, because there were all these other, we saw the Obodrites, there are, you know, of course the Bohemians, the Moravians, right? They're all recorded in the 10th and 11th centuries in Ottonian service. Even Danish auxiliaries, Vikings, right, are sometimes mentioned. By the mid-11th century, so we are in the late Viking era, they apparently sometimes served even as cavalry, right? Because Danish forces were typically, like, in a numerical sense, infantry. But, as we know, Denmark was also the more advanced of all the Scandinavian countries, was the one that had Christianized the earliest and had imported, just because they were next door and also fearing actually the Ottonian invasion. That's why they reinforced the Dannevirke among the other things, and compacting the Jutland, the Straits under some sort of monarchic rule, say, effectively controlling the territory. And together with that, of course, there was also at a high level, like the use of sending some troops fighting for the House of Saxon. Why not? If we want to foster relations with them, you know, political connections, trade, something you want to exchange. Like the Danes want to be, the Danish elites want to be as powerful as the Ottonian one. Like they import their arms and armor. They, you know, the Rhineland historically had been exporting swords, blades, also sometimes just to the Scandinavian world, and that was very attractive for that aristocracy. So it's really not strange, right? However, these peoples were considered by the Germans like B-series, right? Not just the importance of infantry and unarmored cavalry was declining sharply in Germany. But properly on the field, the Saxon horsemen were proving to be very effective, also in guerrilla fighting against the continuous Norse raids in the north. Right, this would never come to threaten to destabilize the Duchy of Saxony or the Eastern Frankish Kingdom as a whole, but there were annoyances, right? Because Saxony controlled also, like, this northern frontier was in many ways also a bit decentralized. We have seen it in the videos about Holstein. But exactly for this reason, this cavalry was that versatile. Don't think that being heavy means you can't fight against Viking raids and infiltrations of this kind. This is what, along the Atlantic coast, and not only, by the way, the post-Carolingian military had to cope with in a way or another, right? And that continental model, that Imperial Christian Roman model, was being affirmed as the superior one over these other people, right? And this happened also internally, the social level. That's why free peasants had now been virtually excluded from the armies, except as sort of despised auxiliaries that weren't entrusted even with properly military functions, because they did not detain the Imperium. And do not underestimate this aspect, because literally now the Ottonians are the Roman emperors, and so they can afford to say, like, I have an intrinsically superior metaphysical condition over the others, and so have my retinues, my men, and all the peoples that I manage to control in a way or another, because you do not necessarily need to conquer them and directly governing over them with your own administration. You just need, by deterrence, for example, to make them freak out, right, and to be aware. Like, they were difficult to contain because mostly were politically fragmented, but the Ottonians, as you know, were working also in that direction with the papacy to actually coagulate more powerful principalities, monarchies that could be converted to Christianity, and also to stabilize this frontier at a point, because the Germans actually were quite excited about the idea of sort of conquering around, but one of the reasons why the Danes, the Poles, etc. would Christianize was sort of escaping this constant German infiltration. Like the Danube was another route of expansion, as you know. That's why the Magyars also convert to Christianity when they are beaten by the Ottonians, and they factually stop invading the West. Right, that's what they stop. They try a bit in the Balkans. They see it sucks, kind of, and so they decide, okay, well, let's turn finally into some fully sanitary feudal Christian state, because that's sort of the only thing we have left, right? But that's how the Ottonians defeated them in Germany, reconquered Italy in an imperial sense, and truly established this whole that is like extremely complicated to control. Like the fact that the Ottonians will barely control even a half of Germany, realistically, and so their imperial authority was in many ways floating over areas that sort of said, okay, well, we recognize you as overlord as much as you don't specifically oppress in a concentrated area, and sort of, so we maintain you up to be a sort of police force, but let's not kid about. Like, if you look at the problems that Otto III had in Rome, or the general issues that the monarchy always had with the German princes, it was always sort of a great difficulty, or rebellions, etc. A little mention can be made for urban militias. Germany did have cities historically in the Roman part, the former Roman territory. So we're talking again the Rhineland and mostly southern Germany. There were true cities, like big Cologne that became one of the largest cities in Europe, but you have Regensburg, you have, other centers that have also maybe a more limited importance, but they are true, like they're mostly towns as a matter of fact, but they have city walls, they are connected, and so they also develop some sort of political autonomy, right? With the increase of encapsulation, such fortified towns would be getting lesser importance in relative terms, meaning that they would actually grow, but Germany, as we explained, will always be run sort of by the princes, right? In Germany, you do have, for example, a communal experience, like pretty much everywhere in Western Europe, but you never have like a commune sort of ruling beyond the city walls in a sort of provincial sense, because as soon as they step outside, there was the prince, whether the count or the bishop, and those were the guys who dictated the rule. That's why you don't find even a decisive infantry force in Germany. That's not because the communes did not have their own knights, actually they did, but they didn't have that importance socioeconomically that you find in other places, right? And also the bigger centers are under some prince that manages to keep things under in a mostly feudal sense. So they're not so important. It's fair to say that these urban militias, especially at this point, like talking the 10th century, they are very, very archaic times, did little more than defending their city walls. It's so fundamentally, in spite of the technical means developing over the centuries, like this is what the German communes would mostly be about. So they were of limited military importance. In Austria, that at this point was a frontier area because it had been just redeemed from the Magyars, like claimed back by the Ottonian victories. The local margrave, remember this is a frontier area, summoned cowherds and swineherds against the Bohemians, but so only in the direst emergency, and despite this general decline, there was already, like only in that exception of the country that would never quite be controlled directly by the German monarchs, of some rise in the status of certain infantry forces. We're talking about the ones of Flanders and Brabant, right? I made a video about Brabant some couple of months ago. We talked about medieval Flanders, so we have seen how all the progression, like these were areas that during the 10th century, the 9th to 10th, had remained during the second invasions very much on their own, because they were peripheral. They were at the time actually depressed, so nobody really cared more than much about them, even if you could control the Rhine, that important river system for exports in the North Sea, etc. There were the Vikings out there anyway, and the post-Carolingian kingdoms were not like a naval. They were not navally oriented in the first place. So in many ways, these local communities had autonomized themselves, right? And even when the German monarchs tried to regain control of them, they sort of always escaped, right? They were too decentralized, they were too peripheral. And later on, when the northern waters calmed a bit, like these would begin to these communities begin to rise in wealth, through commerce, etc. So you have, for example, like there were interesting infantries, nothing glamorous yet. Again, they have to develop. These places are actually run by a feudal aristocracy as well, and that has the upper hand. So by the 10th century, you can't speak of the forces of pikemen, like the ones that had themselves cut down to the last man at the Battle of Bouvines, all right? But some of these guys were already, becoming, for example, mercenaries and having a future, at least in that direction, that starts, if you wanted that one. That's sort of the only area of say, Germany, that of course would be also maintaining some kind of an identity of its own, a bit detached from even the same royal authority, whatever, that has some relevant infantry development. That is, again, we are in the 10th century, not the greatest, right? There are toughest infantries in a sense when you look at the dismounted Militas, right? Rather than a communal phenomenon where the commoners were strong infantry per se. Then, of course, I should say that because of the general lack of surplus in the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, of course, you do find in relative terms to these sort of, infantry as, some forces could put down those horsemen that were out there, but it's declining, right? And it's living in a world where nobody basically defends their rights, their autonomy, their liberty, right? So they are destined in Germany to go under. And that's pretty much the feedback. Naturally, there would be so much to say about Ottonian warfare and even just about the army organization at this point that we'll see in other videos. However, I'm very glad to have founded this to have placed this stone, let's say, because we go again step by step. We like to take it, not slowly, but going by degrees, right? Setting all the various stones next to one another, building up this thing. And again, I'm satisfied at this point of Schwerpunkt with the way the playlists are starting to take shape. Because again, we have some good number of videos, right, on the topics, and mixing general history with the military bias is always important for a channel fundamentally founded on medieval warfare. But as you know, I'm stepping up a little bit. We're probably going to cover more military history, strictly speaking. Here again, the Ottonian playlist contains, as we see, 13 videos. Here actually, strange thing, Ottonian Germany. Yes, because I contain, we have an Ottonian Germany in the sense of many videos, especially about the regional series, that sort of overlaps a bit with the Ottonian period as well. So they ended up contained, but on the Ottonians specifically made only 13 videos. This is the 14th. About the 10th century, we have 45 videos. So again, we need to make more. We need to keep on hammering on, right? And this video is surely going to help that as well. Always remember that there are playlists that correspond to sort of series by themselves, and or some just easier access from which you can easily categorize the content you're more interested in and choosing it accordingly. So this is how it works, right? Schwerpunkt is growing. We're continuing like this, and that's fine. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.